picture. When we think about legal issues in a disaster, we need to realize that we're talking about the intersection of law, bioethics, medicine. We're thinking about the intersection of the three. When we think about the law, we really are looking at government, governmental agencies, how they interact, how they function. We think about how these agencies are established in the first place. Those of you with whom I've had the honor to share thoughts on medical jurisprudence and medical ethics understand and realize that the foundation of government in the United States and in each of the states is based upon a constitution. Our Constitution has within it articles and amendments. In those amendments we have the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment. Those provide us with due process and equal protection under the law. When we are looking at modifying legal rights and protections in a disaster, we have to keep in mind Fifth Amendment, 14th Amendment, due process, equal protection under the law, so that we understand and realize the ability to modify laws and the protections provided citizens when we do so. When we think about bioethics, those of you with whom I had the privilege, pleasure, and honor to share thoughts on Beauchamp and Childress's concept coming in the 1970s of, bless you, of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. When we think about disasters, we're going to think about these issues and the modification of them. What becomes primary in a disaster when we look at bioethics? Primary in a disaster, we're going to see issues of beneficence and non-maleficence, and we're going to see justice, which is the equitable distribution of health care, as mentioned in the talks before mine. When we get into an emergency situation, we have to start thinking about who and when and where care is given, triaging, what level of care we can provide. Talk about that more in the slides in this section. In medicine, primum non nocere, above all else, do no harm. We're thinking about the legal issues. The legal issues we think about, we will also talk about volunteerism. Some individuals may receive payment and others may not. So we also think about issues of cost to governments and to local entities, and there's only so much resource to go around. The learning objectives, we're going to talk about general legal and regulatory frameworks for disaster response. We'll look at core ethical issues that are common in disaster planning and response, and we will talk about the standard of care in disasters. Individual rights. Individual rights, as mentioned here, the U.S. Constitution and its amendments provide us these rights. Fifth Amendment, as we talked about earlier, due process, that is how rights are promulgated and protected. Fourth, equal protection, meaning everyone is to be protected equally under the law and given the same rights and privileges. However, there are times when we're going to have to modify these. How are they modified? They're modified in a compelling interest. What are compelling interests? Compelling interests are keeping dangerous people away from us and keeping dangerous situations from spreading. Interventions, they have to be well targeted. We have to specifically intervene. Use of the least restrictive means necessary. Again, this is a balance. So we talk about issues of isolation, issues of separation, and we talk about issues of quarantine. We'll address those. We look to the least restrictive means. And due process, we apply due process. We still provide individuals the necessary and requisite legal protections under the law. Federal roles, state roles. This is critical in a disaster. It's important to keep in mind, and we'll hit this with other slides. We're talking about local issues. Disasters occur typically in a specific place. Now they can be in a larger place or a smaller place. However, we look to what's happening in that local scene. We look to it typically and traditionally within a state jurisdiction. The state is the primary center of dealing with the issue. Federal government doesn't come in unless and until it is asked. And that is from a governor to then the federal government. The president, him or herself, can be contacted, and then federal agencies become involved. And we'll talk about that. The federal role deals with interstate commerce, national defense, taxing and spending for the public welfare. Then the state roles. This is where public health law comes into play. Police powers. The police powers mean typically regulation. Doesn't necessarily mean that a police officer shows up. Police power means the state has the right to regulate what we can and cannot do. And the purpose is to protect and serve the public. Public health emergency powers include surveillance, reporting, epidemiologic investigation, power over property, voluntary or mandatory, vaccination, isolation, treatment, social distancing, and evacuation. Public health powers, as I just mentioned, are all located here in this slide, showing you what the public health emergency powers include. Now, disaster declarations, where do they come from? Where do they begin? They start with the state. Starts there. And then the declaration triggers public health emergency powers. As the last slide showed, once there's a declaration made, those powers kick in. The state then can request federal assistance, and that then can be provided either through the Secretary of Health and Human Services, or the President of the United States can act through the Stafford Act and then intervene to provide services to the state. Now, when we look at what the federal government can do, we have a progression of laws that have helped to limit federal intervention. When we look at these in 1807, this was Thomas Jefferson's period, we had the limit of what the federal government can do within the states. And it limits the use of federal forces within state borders. Then the Posse Comitatus Act, many have heard of that, 1878, Posse Comitatus. That was passed after Reconstruction, after the Civil War, and that required an act of Congress for the use of federal forces for law enforcement. Stafford Act, 1988. This is the act whereby the governor of a state, and we've seen this recently in the disaster of a hurricane on the East Coast. And we saw a governor walking with the President of the United States, because that governor had requested through the President of the United States, through the Stafford Act, for federal intervention to assist those in the disaster. Governor requests assistance, the President declares a disaster, FEMA then can respond. These are the three pillars of civil support. What you'll notice when you look at this, you will see, while the President is at the top, the President is not initially activated. You see, the dotted lines go from the governor. The governor of the state is the key. The governor of the state here contacts the President or contacts DHS, and through that process, the Department of Defense can be activated as well. And you will notice below the Secretary of the Department of Defense, you'll see the U.S. Northern Command. The U.S. Northern Command was established because we didn't have a process or an agency whereby federal services could really pinpoint processing within the United States. And hence, the U.S. Northern Command was established. The 3 R's, ethics in disaster response. The 3 R's. When we think about the 3 R's, we're looking at responsibility to care despite personal risk, the duty to treat and care and how it is limited, restrictions on liberty, and notice, these are to ensure protection of the uninjured population, to include the application of quarantine, isolation, and social distancing. Quarantine is restricting population at large, or those who have been exposed. Isolation is keeping those who are actively ill in a separate spot. And social distancing is closing active centers such as shopping malls in order to keep people from interacting and spreading a disease or some other type of contamination. Resource allocation dilemmas. This occurs in a setting where casualty needs are greater than the available resources. This goes to the bioethical concept of justice. And this is, how do we equitably distribute care when the resources are very limited? This necessitates the use of rationing and crisis standards of care. The duty to treat. What is our duty to treat? And how do we intervene as physicians? We've talked about the issues of government, which we will talk about again. However, we talked about law, Constitution, Fifth Amendment, 14th Amendment. We talked about the bioethics. And now we're looking at medicine, the duty to treat. We as physicians and clinicians have a duty to treat. We have a moral obligation. We have been given special training. We come into medicine because we really do care. The duty to treat. Oftentimes, it entails personal risk. And so now we are being put at personal risk when we intervene to treat. The duty to treat extends from the social contract between caregivers and society. The benefits of professional status are accepted by us by fulfilling known obligations. So we have been given a specific status in society, and along with that comes a responsibility. The responsibility is to treat. It comes from our special training because we have the skills and the knowledge that others don't. We have an obligation or responsibility to use those skills to help those who are affected and afflicted by the disaster. The duty to treat includes non-discrimination based on those with disease, so we cannot refuse care of infected patients, especially in a disaster. We have this moral and ethical responsibility to provide care. The duty to serve or treat entails personal risk, as we mentioned, and it is noted that police and firefighters have a 1 to 5% higher risk in their lifetime of mortality on the job. There are limits, however, to this duty to treat. I'm going to zip forward just to see if that is yes. There are limits on this duty to treat. You see, we as the caregivers have to survive in order to continue to treat. So we have to be very careful. There is a reciprocal social obligation. What is that? We have to have personal protective equipment when we're providing care so that we can continue to provide the care. And the personal safety is essential so that we do not become a casualty as well. And as Dr. Lovie is going to describe in his lecture, one of the dilemmas is when healthcare providers are providing care in a disaster situation, we are not immune to the emotional toll that it takes. We are not immune to the psychological, hence psychiatric impact that we experience as we see fellow citizens, other human beings, suffering dramatically. We are impacted also. So we have to keep that in mind. Dr. Lovie is going to address issues of that in his talk and presentation. There's no absolute threshold for treatment in the context of disaster. Therefore, crisis standards of care come into play. And what are these crisis issues? These issues require that sometimes less care than usual is given because of resource constraints. And as mentioned in the talk before us, this is very difficult. because we're used to giving everything we possibly can. There are going to be times we don't have everything, and I will just say this isn't in the manual. As DOs, those in the room here who are osteopathic physicians, you do have an added tool, and that is when there is no electricity, when there is no power, you still have the tools of your hands and the osteopathic techniques that allow you to treat in ways that we're not able to treat when we lose certain of the modern technologies that we have. And that is a bonus as an osteopathic physician. Volunteer and worker compensation. Now, it's interesting to note that, first of all, as we'll say in slides later, volunteers need to be organized. The entire disaster protocol is to have organization and be prepared before the disaster. Hence, you all are here being trained. So you're prepared. Because we don't want individuals just showing up, not knowing what they're doing, and serving instead of, as a caregiver, serving as a barrier to care being provided. So it's very, very important that responder status be understood. And in this process, some responders may be compensated, others may not. Some may be in an employee status, others may not. Some states will define volunteers as state employees during a disaster. Some volunteers as temporary employees may be eligible for receiving benefits from an institution that may be receiving benefits to provide the care. There will be different types of employees. There will be different types of volunteers. What all of this brings to the fore is standards of care and liability. What happens when it comes to liability? We're going to look at that because in a moment we'll talk about the Uniform Emergency Volunteer Health Practitioner Act, which has provided for licensing issues as well as liability issues. Volunteers and regulatory issues. Here we are. You see, licensure and credentialing. What happens if a disaster happens in a specific state and we need help from nearby states, bordering states? What if individuals in a bordering state don't necessarily have the same licensure as they do in the state wherein service is needed? Can they still come in? This is where the UEV-HPA comes into play. One can provide care in that state for so long as one is already licensed. However, one cannot practice outside the scope of the licensure allowed within the state where it is being provided. There are waivers of licensure, however, and there are assistance compacts between states, and there is a list. We don't have it in the slides, I believe. 7 states have adopted a version of UEV-HPA, and those states are Arkansas, Colorado, Indiana, Kentucky, New Mexico, Tennessee, bless you, and Utah. And the reason I mention that, if you're going to be in any of those states, if you're practicing there, and or if you're in one of those states during a disaster. Volunteers and liability. Again, all these slides play in together. There is, within this concept, we've discussed before, the concept of Good Samaritan statutes. The real key is this. The real key is that one not act with gross negligence. That one act with good medical practice. Because for so long as we act within the scope of our skills and within good medical practice, typically liability will not attach, especially in a disaster situation, especially with the given compacts and laws, UEV, HPA, that are there. Willful misconduct, wanton, grossly negligent, reckless, or criminal conduct or activity, you will not be protected from liability for that. An intentional tort, liability will still attach. What is an intentional tort? Intentionally doing wrong. Intentional wrongdoing. Breach of contract, claim asserted by a host entity. An act or omission related to the operation of a motor vehicle, vessel, aircraft. Again, that depends on the state in which you find yourself practicing and or assisting in an emergency. The bottom line in regard to the duty to treat is that health professionals have opportunities and responsibilities to be part of an effective disaster response. Covered this. Now, I mentioned 7, but according to this, by 2011, 12 states and the District of Columbia have adopted UEB HPA. So it's more than the 7. 7 I mentioned have something similar to this. Again, encouraging organized volunteers. Encouraging the volunteers is important. Having them trained is important. What we don't want is volunteers presenting who are neither trained nor part of the protocol. So we have to be very careful. We don't want individuals just showing up because they can present a problem as opposed to helping with the organized implementation of a disaster protocol. Restrictions on liberty. In a disaster, we are able to restrict liberty when necessary and within the confines of the 5th and 14th Amendments. What is the difference between quarantine, isolation, social distancing, and curfew? Quarantine separates or restricts movement of healthy people exposed or potentially exposed. Again, what happens and what has been found in situations wherein a quarantine was imposed, individuals don't always respond well to that. And in imposing or attempting to impose a quarantine, individuals may leave the scene and may become hostile to the rules and regulations that need to be invoked. And that can create an issue. Isolation, on the other hand, is separating those known to be ill or infected from the rest of the community. So again, remember, quarantine is involving separation or restriction of movement of healthy people perceived to have been exposed to contaminant, where isolation is separating those known to have been infected or exposed or ill from it. Social distancing reduces exposure risk by closing areas of communal gathering, canceling events, closing schools, closing malls. And the curfew, as you all know, imposes time limits on population activity and where they can be and at what time to minimize high-risk behaviors. Yes?
I have a question about the social distancing and closing down civilian commercial enterprises.
Yes.
Is there ever it's more of a legal question. We were in charge of a community and making that decision. Do those private organizations ever have recourse to come back and sue us, the city or the state or the federal government for like loss of revenue or defamation of their image in the public? Don't go to the mall, you'll get blankety blank. What does that say?
Okay. What happens is this. Again, we're looking at, and that's a very good question, the balance between commerce and safety. And what happens is, if we're looking at a situation where a disaster has been declared, and it has been declared, then different laws come into play. And then the right to effect social distancing or isolation does come into play. And an action would have to show that there was either malfeasance in the declaration was inappropriately stated, so that whoever called for the disaster, the declaration of disaster, did so with maleficence at play. Does that make sense? So again, if in good faith the disaster was declared and a business loses revenue, there most likely wouldn't be an action because it was all done in good faith. Now Again, defamation, that becomes another issue, and that ultimately results in, oftentimes, a jury determining whether or not they feel that the defamation was a malicious action. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's a very good question, yes. Typically, a disaster isn't declared unless there really is a disaster. You know, I don't know if we've had any episodes. If anyone knows, please share of a you know, a preemptive kind of declaration, and then nothing happened, and then individuals claim that that was meant to harm them economically or by reputation. If you know, that then becomes an issue for a court to decide. Yes. In this, what are we looking at? We're looking at a balance. There is a balance between public safety and personal liberty. What we have to look at is the context. And there's been a lot of literature written with regard to this, and I won't quote all that. However, there was written in 1991, quote, "The ethos of public health and that of civil liberties are radically distinct." So again, because there is a difference in what each require, the context helps to define the balance. And we have to look at the context, the situation when these occur. Now, the United Nations espoused in 1984, there was a conference in Greece, and the Syracuse principles were enunciated and articulated at that time for the initiation of coercive public health measures. Such measures must be legitimate, legal, necessary, and non-discriminatory with, again, the least restrictive means appropriate to the reasonable achievement of public health goals. So again, in answering your question, in declaring a disaster, again, we can look to the principles as espoused in 84 via the UN as to how do we handle this, what direction do we go? Ethical predications. Again, we talked about the law, medicine, bioethics, and the ethics that are subsumed within this concept of bioethics. And the philosopher John Stuart Mill, as seen here on the slide, defined the harm principle in the context of restrictions of liberty in the following way. He stated, and I quote, "The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. The ethical dilemma posed by restriction is eased if the restriction is effective for its intended purpose." So the basic principle of it's not what you say, it's how you say it. It's not what you do, it's how you do it. 90% of life is packaging. When you look at that, and I attribute that to the philosopher Sidney Aaron Goldman, Dad. Same thing with the disaster. It's how we present it. It's how the necessary agency presents that there is a disaster. And then all of the rest of the steps fall into place. Then we see the appropriate Syracuse type approach, and then we work to the least restrictive protocol. We want to avoid harm, and that is the key, and harm to others. We're looking for effectiveness. The effectiveness of any intervention to restrict liberty can depend on many factors. And what do they depend on? The degree to which individuals in the community are willing to go along with the restriction. That makes a big difference. We have to present it in a way so that the citizens understand and are willing to participate appropriately. Social characteristics. Trust in local public health authorities. That is important, especially if a mandatory quarantine is necessary. It is important for it to look voluntary by the citizens. And that's one of the reasons prior to disasters it is so important for local health authorities to have programs that reach out to the community, that explain who they are and what they do. And that's one of the reasons that it is not inappropriate for some of our tax dollars to be used for appropriate advertising for local health protocols and programs, so that citizens are aware of the health services. It is also important that as long as individuals feel that it's important, they trust the health officials, they become voluntarily participatory, it works. Conversely, if the affected group does not trust the public health authority to do what is right, then it is unlikely even a mandatory quarantine will be fully effective. We've seen this across international borders, where individuals, with SARS, quarantines were imposed, individuals left. And we also saw mass screenings with SARS, and large amounts of individuals were screened and very small yield was derived. So again, it's important for the public, for the individuals, to trust the healthcare officials, trust the health officials, public health officials, as well as healthcare officials, and to participate in a way that is voluntary. We also know that key issues, if we look at disease and injury factors, the duration, how long is a contaminant viable? The transmissibility, how is it transmitted? What is the rate of recovery? And what is the environmental stability? These are issues. How fast will something be transmitted? What can we do to slow that speed? How do we intervene to do that? These are key issues. Next, effectiveness. We know that real humans are going to kick in with the survival instinct. So again, no matter what we impose, or no matter what we seek to achieve, we have to be aware of human nature. We have to keep that in mind. We have to be aware that any action that we undertake may create a response that we had not intended. The unintended consequence of our actions, we don't want to create panic, because panic then can cause the entire situation to crumble and fall apart. Effective communication is essential. That's why it is so important for the responders in a disaster to have their communication system already in place and ready to go when a disaster is declared. And as we can see, mass screening is largely ineffective. I mentioned that earlier. We've seen that from experience, that mass screenings tend to have a small yield. Quarantine that is done poorly can lead to mistrust and panic. If this happens, it's not merely ineffective, it can become harmful. And frightened people who choose to run from a quarantine disperse into the population, and then we are at risk of spreading that which we had hoped to contain. Again, here we are, quarantine and looking at quarantine. Quarantine is, as noted, not always the effective approach, because it can lead to undesired results. Waiver of federal rights. Federal regulations may be waived when the President declares an emergency and the Secretary of Health and Human Services declares a public health emergency. The waiver applies within the period of emergency to the declared emergency area and hospitals that have been activated for 72 hours. There are two relevant regulations that may be waived. One of the two relevant ones, EMTALA, the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act. What does EMTALA require? EMTALA requires when patients present to an emergency room at a hospital, they have to be assessed and evaluated before they can be transferred somewhere else. In an emergency situation, this may be modified. Under normal circumstances, we have to screen individuals before we can transfer. HIPAA privacy requirements under the HIPAA are modified, can be modified in an emergency situation when so declared as listed on the slide. Now, what are the components that may be waived in HIPAA? Well, I will share those with you. I hope, let's see, how am I doing time-wise, slide-wise? I may have to scoot on here momentarily. Requirements to obtain a patient's agreement to speak with family members or friends involved, that may be waived. Requirements to honor a request to opt out of the facility directory, that is waived. Requirements to distribute a notice of privacy practice, we don't have to worry about that in this type of a situation. Patient's right to request privacy restrictions, waived. And the patient's right to request confidential communications, waived. Rationing. This comes under the bioethical concept of justice, and in a disaster situation, rationing can become a key issue because of limited resources. Now, when we look at this, there are hierarchies of how we treat and how we intervene, and different ones may be put into place. And this shows possible approaches. There can be save most lives. That's higher risk, because now, if we're going to save the most lives, we may have an unintended consequence of putting more lives at risk. Save most life years. That's looking at individuals who have the most amount of life left, and then save most productive life years. We look at those who, this is rationing based upon who will benefit the most and what they can give back. And then if we look at women and children first concept, that may be applied. First come, first served. That's whoever shows up. We can get them to a safe place, and then market-based. What will help put resources back into the system and the community. Rationing is necessary and inevitable. It is not a choice for healthcare providers under these conditions. We have to leave this, bless you, to those who are responsible and in charge of managing the disaster situation and establishing the protocols. Now, standard of care. Standard of care, perform to the highest reasonable standard of care. Here is the key, under the given circumstance. And where does that come in? Standard of care depends on the context. We have to deal with what we have. We have to deal with the resources. We have to deal with the time frames. We have to deal with who we have available. That is the context. It is not our usual and customary routine. We may not be in a position where we can say, I need to order the following labs. The lab may not be available for all of that. It may be overburdened. So again, it's a different standard of care. This is very difficult for all of us as clinicians, as physicians. It's very difficult to feel that we are serving under what is our usual and customary standard of care. This will have an impact on us psychologically, psychiatrically. And Dr. Lovey is going to talk about that. Because when you're in a disaster situation and you are providing care, it becomes incumbent upon you to give the necessary care for that moment. And that makes us, when we leave that situation, we're going to second guess ourselves. Could I have done this? Should I have done this? Was this appropriate? Was it not? Again, substantial change in operations and level of care. It's made necessary by the pervasive or the catastrophic disaster itself. It is justified by the circumstances. And it has been declared by the state government, perhaps then pulling the federal government in. There may be a sustained period of altered operations, and this is something that we just have to keep in mind and be aware and deal with. Crisis care implementation. In doing so, in successfully implementing crisis care, crisis standards of care require the following. There must be fairness. It has to be recognized as fair by all involved in the disaster. The equitable processes, we would like them to be transparent, consistent, proportional, accountable. We would like participatory engagement in the development, promulgation, pre-event, and in application post-event, so that we already have an idea of what our standards are going to be, so that all participating are on the same page. And it's governed by the rule of law with defined authority in an appropriate legal environment. This provides legal acknowledgement that the context exists for crisis care. So again, what we're really talking about is a state of mind. We are coming into a disaster, into a crisis, with a state of mind understanding that these four components are to what we look for the standard of care in a crisis. Now, what are the core ethical challenges? Well, the core ethical challenges are the difference between the differences between the care. Expectant care has an ethical basis in settings of severe injuries and resource shortage. Expectant care is comfort care. We are helping the patient. We may not be giving the full standard of care that we would be used to outside of a disaster. However, it is important for us to understand casualties who are absolutely unsalvageable require comfort care without expending resources for cure. This is very difficult for us. Casualties with injuries too great for resources available may be relatively unsalvageable under the circumstances. However, this may change as the casualties for resources change. So we have to keep this in mind, that crisis standard, in many ways, is a sliding scale, because as resources change, that may change. The intent of comfort care is just that, comfort. Thus, comfort care is not equivalent to euthanasia. And for us, we have to keep that in mind. We are not engaging in euthanasia. As was said prior to this legal talk, there will be times when, for all intent and purpose, your actions determine who maybe survives and who doesn't. What you are doing is looking at the resources and looking at the care that can be provided and providing that care which is appropriate as crisis care in that situation. It is not euthanasia. AMA and the ANA, the American Medical Association, the American Nursing Association, have statements on how to approach and how to triage, and they highlight the expectant challenge, and they note that judgments are more properly considered by the respective licensing board. So again, this issue is context of care. So we have to keep that in mind. Use limited resources fairly. We want to achieve the greatest benefit. We want to preserve ethical obligations. And we want to provide comfort. Always provide comfort. We make decisions based on situational awareness. That's transparent and consistent. We want to be, when we make a decision, be able to verbalize the reason the decision is made, and we want it to be consistent for all during that crisis. We want to avoid, as it says here, ad hoc decisions by individuals. We don't want individuals coming in and changing the rules and making their own rules. This is to be organized. This is to have protocols. That is the reason you all are in this course. That is the reason you all are being trained to be skilled in this kind of a situation. What is the first level of civil support from disasters? What is the first level? What do you all think? Local. Absolutely. It is local. It's where it starts. And then, of course, what happens, then state gets involved, the state can call in the feds. What is isolation? Remember, we talked about quarantine, isolation, social distancing, and then we mentioned curfews as well. What is isolation? It is C. You're right. Separation of ill people. Remember, we're just focusing on those who are ill. Standard of care in disasters. What is the standard of care in disasters? Does it permit euthanasia? No, it does not. We said it's not euthanasia. Does it refer to the routine standard? No. Again, we're not going to be using our routine standard. Does it require government intervention? Perhaps, ultimately, yes. However, what is the real key? It's dependent on the context. Every disaster is different. Every disaster has its own context. And we have to hold ourselves to the standard of care based upon the context of the disaster. Questions? I'm going to give the lesson summary. State and federal response. Remember, it's tiered and coordinated. It's local is the issue. It starts with the state. Governor can go to federal government and ask them to intervene and therefore bring in FEMA. The ethical framework, remember the 3 R's, responsibility, restrictions, and resources. Standard of care. Standard of care, as it says here, is always dependent upon the context. These 3 links of rope help to illustrate what we've discussed, the 3 R's. And you'll notice that each one of these ropes varies in length. We have a short rope, a medium rope, and a long length of rope. Talking about disasters. They start at the same place. They end at 3 different places. If we take the ends of the ropes and we even them up, so now the ropes begin and end at the same place, would you say that they're all equal? And the answer is no, because their middles are different, which reminds us, no 2 disasters are exactly alike. However, our approach to the disasters have to all be the same, even though the disasters are different. You see, our approach all has to be based on context of the disaster, and that is our goal. Thank you very much. I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Goldman.